step probably consistently through for me. I like to know I'm right, or at least as right as I can be, so tests are good, and start presenting ideally from early on what the model is doing, what the key benefits are, how it's going to interact with key segments. Then, depending on the organisations, I've done a lot with finance and insurance and stuff as well. It's what does your sign-off process look like to be able to say that this model is fit for purpose, and then shipping that into production effectively. And never forget, you've got a retraining or calibration parts as well. So there's ongoing monitoring and updating that gets very easily forgotten off of the hello world processes.
Anything that you'd add to that, Alistair?
I'm quite big on my review processes. I'm talking about horror stories where I was working for a financial services company again, and we were checking whether or not somebody was reportable or not reportable for a particular legislation, and people in the bank going through manually classifying whether or not this person was reportable or not. So it's a good process that we could emulate with machine learning. But during the build process of that model, the code review was not done up to scratch. The labels for reportable and not reportable were switched the wrong way around. The model was deployed into production. The people who were doing the process they were let go, so replaced with the model. And then 3 months later, people come back and say this model is making bad predictions, and they were extremely angry, obviously. It takes a long time to rehire those people back to do that process again. That would have never happened if there was a solid review process, just checking have you got your labels correct, and that should happen for the analysis code as well as the production code base as well.
And doing things like having the model that you've built shadow the manual process so that you can compare and see in production whether the model's actually hitting the goal.
I do agree with that, yes. I think there is a desire to go really quickly into deploying a model and say reducing headcount in your business, for example, but that is quite a dangerous thing to do.
So I'm looking at our poll, and I thought it might be helpful to actually clarify some of the roles that we've shared here, because it's actually a common question I get a lot, like what's the difference between a data analyst and a data scientist, and then what's the difference between a data engineer and a software engineer. So in our poll, we've asked if you can help us out by understanding which skill sets you most identify with across software engineering, data engineering, infrastructure and DevOps, data scientist, analyst, manager, and tech founder. So with all of those different titles, how do you help people understand the different roles within going from proof of concept to production with data science?
So one important one for me is data engineering. I think people do tend to forget data engineering. It might be because people view data scientist as the sexy role, but there's a lot of, say, data warehousing and data manipulation that's required to even start your project, let alone actually deploy it. And sometimes that role can fall to data scientists, and quite often data scientists might not want to be doing that job. I think there's a bit of a debate about whether or not they should be. And I'm sure people have their opinions about that. But I'm really kind of focusing, for me, on that data engineering side. I think that's quite important. Your opinions on that?
So typically when we're doing data science, it starts off with the data engineers and the data scientists working with business stakeholders. So there might commonly be a business analyst in the mix as well, helping to understand the domain, because if you make bad assumptions at the beginning, you end up with flipped labels and things. And then with a lot of data science teams, when they start hitting a more mature process, it starts looking a bit more like software engineering. And certainly getting applications into production and getting data assets into production is something that a lot of IT people have been working on for a very long time. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned there that a cross-functional team can really bring to the table, but you have to also balance out that these are also a new type of thing to be deployed, so there's definitely also some things that need to vary. So I've seen some horror stories of where people just go, I can write this is just a software project, so I can write the code once, I can test it, and I can deploy the model, and that's it. I've got CI, CD, that's all we need. But it needs a bit more domain expertise in the machine learning and data science side and the business domain. That means that you need more people in the room and a willingness to kind of learn from each other.
On that, where you said, because I completely agree with you actually, Steph, that there are parts of the process that are, I think, well understood within a mature software development team. So are we in danger of reinventing the wheel with the concept of MLOps?
I see a lot of kind of reinvention of the wheel, and this happens a lot in technology anyway, because we kind of have we often have a pendulum of trends. Things like centralized IT to self-service IT happened again and again with data engineering and reporting and software development. We're seeing like big low-code, no-code movements towards kind of democratizing software engineering and things as well now. And I see people trying to source control CSVs and things when really that data is coming from their data lake or their data warehouse, so they should be looking at how they can do better source control their interaction with the data rather than trying to put the whole 200 gigabyte file inside source control. But that comes from not realizing that databases have things like change tracking, and the right data model can make that really easy to say, what did my data look like 6 months ago? So it is a lot of people who haven't talked to each other and learned about some of the benefits from some of the different departments end up reinventing that wheel again and again.
So do you think that there's a lot of siloed teams at the moment?
Yes, there is definitely a lot of silos, and it's also, I think, particularly where data science is still quite an academic subject, people in academia are they're gamified to do a lot of things by themselves, to kind of research and cite, but try and get their stamp on things and get that major publication and get that thesis done, with your primary research being your main being kind of your contribution. And that kind of leads to a very good sense of independence that is a strength, but can also be a bit of a weakness at times, of just not being told that it's okay to go talk to this other faculty to try and get some insight, that you've got to cite from these publications and things, and that kind of, from a psychology perspective, it encourages people to spend more time trying to achieve the solution by themselves than trying to go and work with multiple people to solve the challenge.
I'll comment on that one as well, actually, because I've seen a real shift in more siloed data scientists, and then a wall to overcome to get code productionized. Through embracing like the kind of cross-functional team discipline and having data scientists and product analysts and product managers and software engineers all together in a team with a common goal, doing retrospectives, shared tooling for managing their workload has really made quite a big difference to actually not having those silos anymore. I've got some poll results to share with you. So from those of you that have responded, the familiarity with MLOps, as in applying DevOps best practice to ML, 42% new to this concept and 33% starting to implement. So the vast majority fairly new, which I think makes sense, right? That's why we agree this event today is timely. And then with regards to what folk identify with, it's actually really broad. A mix of software engineers, data engineers, infrastructure, DevOps, and data scientists and analysts, with some managers too. No tech founders on here. And I have a question as well to address. It's quite long, and I'm going to do it justice and read it all out. So, high grit is key for data science. So say that you've got a model with suboptimal performance, and it's based on internal data. So despite your best efforts, i.e. you've tried augmenting the data, new labels and new instances, ensemble models, etc. So when should the business give up on iterating over that initially poor baseline?
Very good question. Yeah. I think this is why we need platforms which allow you to do rapid iteration and get to the model quite quickly so that you can fail quickly. And generally, if you fail, say, within a month as opposed to failing within a year, it's a bit easier to kind of pivot around and do something else. I think also we shouldn't be afraid of deploying things which are just procedural rules. Sometimes we need that because ML is too complex for the problem. Sometimes the data doesn't fit. Sometimes there's other kind of business knowledge that we know in our heads which isn't represented in the data. And also it's kind of easier to deploy in a nice fallback. And also sometimes you might not have the data that you need yet and you haven't collected it, but you need to put something into production now. So you could have the rule-based system and then slowly introduce your model as you get better and better results from your training.
Yeah, it's there's definitely a couple of causes for why your model might not hit performance critical success criteria. One is actually maybe the people are not hitting that success criteria. So it's one of the things that speech to text is now theoretically better than a professional, can hit a level better than a professional transcriber, but they were only 85% accurate, I found, which was quite surprising. So the process could be fuzzy and people might not be good at it. There's also that tacit knowledge of people have the subject domain knowledge and it doesn't make it into the data. Or the data practices might be poor on holding that. The other option is there some external data source that can contribute to fill in that gap? So we do a lot of financial services. If it's not just internal data, can you get it from their credit scores and their extended profiles? Can you get marketing data from and socio-demographic profiles? Can you reposition the question to do an earlier part of the problem which has more data either in the company or externally? So working out your root causes for the issue kind of directs what to solve.
There's one thing I want to pick up on that, which is maybe might seem slightly left field and experimental, but if you are responsible for the collection of your own data, rather than, say, as a data scientist, you might be just given data and they have to do whatever, but if you've got say, a business process which is collecting the data, can you look at how that data is being collected? And there's an element of, say, behavioural economics and behavioural psychology behind it, such as what is the incentive for the person to put the data in correctly so that you have better machine learning models later down the line. Say if there's a field which is very important for your model, that's not mandatory, like get somebody to fill it in, it will improve your model later on. There are so many things you can do looking at the way that your data is collected, which will make things so much easier later down the line.
And for my take on that, when should the business give up on iterating over an initially poor baseline? For much of my career, I feel like I've worked on problems that are very hard to solve given the poor data. And again, despite augmenting data. And I suppose I have had to fall back on a heuristic when trying to explain the challenges to to clients or to the business, which is to say that artificial intelligence did come about by trying to mimic human intelligence and logic. So if a highly trained human can't do it, then at least you start to understand why an ML model can't either. So I think that's another use case for encouraging the business to give up on iterating over a poor baseline, if it just seems extremely hard, even for humans.
And it could be that that model is reasonable in a subset of cases, so you can use the model as an assistant rather than a replacement, and then stop wasting time and go tackle another area. If you help all the people in the business become more productive, then you can scale your business so much more than trying to get marginal gains out of one single area.
Great practical advice. Now, Alistair, you mentioned the value there of platforms which enable you to iterate quickly over using ML models to solve a business problem. Now, with any of those platforms that you've used, and you don't have to name names, although we have some sponsors if anyone's interested, what's a killer feature for you on one of those platforms?
So like I was touching on earlier, the ability to allow data scientists to review other people's notebooks. This includes notebook diffing. So traditionally with your Git-like systems, notebooks just don't work very well when you're looking at them. You just get diffs of HTML. But if you could have something where it goes, this person made this assumption here in this particular cell, and now it's this, and I can go through and say, why did you do that? Or this is wrong, for example. That would solve so many problems later down the line.
Can I introduce you to our Markdown?
Yes, our Markdown is a lot better for that. It really is. And yes, our studio do have tools to allow you to do Python in. But then there's a problem there that the rest of the tooling is leading more towards the notebook rather than the Markdown. So I can understand why people might get confused and trying to pick all these tools, because I certainly do. So
it's a market that hasn't reached stability yet, tooling wise. So on the notebook side, Fast AI introduced a good package for kind of turning notebooks into something more diffable, and I've used the Databricks platform, and that automatically can turn your notebook into Python files and stuff that get source controlled, rather than the Jupyter notebook.
But the concern that I have is when it's turned into, say, a Py file and just lots of code, then I can't look at people's, say, graphics on top of that to say reinforce the assumptions that they've made from a particular line of code. It's this kind of scientific review as opposed to just like a code review, which I haven't. Well, there are some platforms where I think that's possible, but that's something I would really like to see. But I guess a lot of the platforms are thinking more from the deployment perspective. So yes, more from the MLOps side rather than for me as a data scientist.
Well, the data science process is part of the MLOps chain for me. So if you can't do data science well, then you can't guarantee the product that's going to be shipped is going to be any good. So
Very true, very true.
there's no point optimizing a poor thing, like something that's always going to be terrible.
Yeah. One other thing I like to talk about, which I guess comes from my experience of consulting, when you don't manage your own data, some of these tools don't fit that kind of model. There are a lot of companies who take data from various different clients and build models for them, and you need to keep that data separate. You can't have client A's data in the same place as client B's data. And with the licensing, quite often you have to buy a license per client, and that can get very, very expensive. Some platforms are now working towards like a multi-tenant approach, and say with Azure, with built-in things there, you can just put like an instance of your MLOps platform per client, and you don't incur any additional cost that way.
So I wanted to talk about skills now. As data scientists in teams, I think many that I've worked with have reached a consensus that it's at the very least important to share a common language with software engineers, data engineers, the other members of the cross-functional team who are trying to achieve a common goal. But how far down those adjacent skill sets do you think a data scientist should be going now?
See, I don't think that a single language is a good goal. I mean, we don't have software engineers don't have a single language inside of a company. Even when they write JavaScript for their backends, they're still using different versions, and they will use different pieces of tools to be able to get different bits done. There'll be stuff that gets driven in YAML, some that in Bash. And practically that works because using the best tool for the job helps you be more productive. Yes, you need to be able to maintain those effectively across an organization, and that's where a lot of the Dockerization and containerization movement came in for software engineering, because it allows people to do things in the best way and bundle.
Sorry, and when I said common language, I didn't mean common programming. I meant
we're not getting into program language.
No, I meant no, never. I meant common vocabulary.
Yeah.
So that appreciation of what you really mean by deploy and train, continuous integration, common vocabulary more than common language. I agree with you. I think it's too early to say that we've chosen one. Any thoughts on that? And then I think we've got time for one more quick question.
Even though we're not talking about common programming languages, I do still think there is an element to that of so with siloed teams where say the software engineers do this and then the data scientists do this. I mean, having that common language does help with the software engineers to be able to look at the data scientist code and what they're doing, the data scientists to explain what they've actually written to the software engineers. I think maybe sometimes with the separate languages you can't really convey what each other are trying to do, really. I think it's important for data scientists to know what the software engineers are doing, not necessarily replicating what they're doing, but it's say software engineers are building APIs which have data in format. I need to know that. I need to know if our data is going to change, not just they change the API without letting me know and all of my downstream stuff breaks. But then the opposite, also I need to tell the software engineers what I what I need, what I'm doing, how my service would work in the whole wider ecosystem.
And I think that for me is the key for being able to use different languages and things, is you have to take that kind of microservices approach where you have to be able to define what you're expecting to come in and what you're expecting to come out. And within those boundaries, so there's things like domain-driven design and stuff that you can apply to this to fit data science APIs and stuff into your software architecture, that is the fundamental thing. If you communicate between the different functions or the different departments to be able to say, this is what I need from you, and this is what I'm going to give you back. And if I change any of those two things, I'm going to tell you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much to our panel. We've just about run out of time, but clear themes there, I think, of review and quality, business outcomes, communication, and working together. Thanks very much.
Good stuff. Thank you. Thank you, Alistair. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Katie. So I'm wondering whether... Katie, do you want to join me in the bar?
Down here, Katie. Come and have a drink with me.
Katie's going to come on down. While we're doing that, coming up this afternoon, we've got Dan Jeffries at 2:50. They are red teaming. We've got the Tecton workshop at 2:50. And also at 3:40, we've got Aparna Dinakaram on model observability. But Katie, thanks for joining. Let's do your hands.
Thank you.
There you go. There's
Perfect.
a steaming mug of coffee there for you. And
Amazing.
if you don't mind, I'll crack open an alcohol-free beer.
You deserve it. Thanks very much.
So how did it go?
Really interesting. I knew that we'd get different perspectives because Steph and Alistair have got really broad experience. And so it was really good actually to get that kind of outcome of the theme of review and quality, very much the data science perspective, and also some real tips for how to use tooling and what to look for.
Yeah, it sounded quite practical, some sort of, some practical experiential based tips. And so one of the things you touched on, you touched on roles, you touched on skills.
Yeah.
Clearly, like within organisations, there's always some transitions occurring. So people going from, say, analyst to data science. It might be that people swap from software to DevOps or more to the ops side. So should organisationally there be quite some fluidity in allowing people to change and to move?
I think there has to be, and what I've seen is a shift from. Well, I think businesses are starting to understand what it really means to be data driven.
Okay.
So rather than being data informed, they want to be data driven. They want to be able to use data to drive operational processes or to predict or inform or create customer propositions. And so in turn that means that analysts migrate towards a skill set of data scientist.
I see. So instead of data being adjunct, like a bolt-on, it becomes actually sort of centred to the business model, and therefore the importance of data is pretty central.
Yeah, and the other reason I think that when you're working with a team, you do perhaps want some fluidity between analysts and data scientists, is simply that externally there's still so much fluidity. It's not truly understood necessarily. And in one company, you might have been operating as an ML engineer, and in another you might be recognised as a data scientist / software developer, just because it's a new enough field that I don't think we've settled into our naming conventions yet.
And does that really depend on the individual's preference for how far they want to stretch their role? And it might be that some people are just very happy doing the traditional, inverted commas, data science role, and that's fine. So how and being abstract away from the other processes is absolutely fine. So is that it just comes down to the individual preference?
I think it's individual preference, and actually it's also just sometimes necessity. So if you're working in a team and there's a gap, and you're a curious learner, that's how you've got into the field in the first place, then you might be picking up a piece of tooling that was outside of your skill set, and then so by need. By virtue of what your objective is, you end up going slightly broader than you might have done.
Okay. And
then you can just keep reviewing and figure out where that means you go.
Your poll sort of came up with some interesting numbers in terms of people out there on this journey. So it seems that quite a few people are just finding it as the hot topic within their organisation and for them. So presumably there's a few journeys that people are going on.
Absolutely. And I think that's partly down to what Alistair was saying about the fact that there's quite a breadth of infrastructure and data platform capability at different organisations. And so we're not all starting from scratch with our data in the cloud, with continuous integration and with a great kind of product engineering understanding. And so for many businesses who want to adopt ML and data science, they need to figure out how to do that with the perhaps monolithic systems, data centers that they have.
Yeah. So there's a legacy sort of question. What is already in-house? What do you have? What do you want to build? What do you buy in? But presumably that should be driven by the not by the tooling. I think the contention is that the tooling should always support the needs. And then we were hearing there from Alistair about say Diffing the notebooks. That sounds like a very sort of computer sciencey thing. Obviously diffing code and doing pull requests for changing code is the norm. So these norms obviously establish themselves within data science.
I think it's what I was hearing him talk about with the quality and the diffing was the story of exploration. Like it's, you have to find bugs.
Yeah.
You have to be able to find
review,
issues.
That review process seems that came across loud and clear.
Absolutely key, and that's because I suppose with the panel we were lucky to have practitioners who are using ML and data science in practice in business, and so they know that they're iterating towards an outcome.
Yes. Okay. And where do you start? So my original thesis at the start of the day was that MLOps is representing effectively a knowledge gap between data on one side and ops on the other. Do you think that holds water, or am I sort of wildly off the mark with that? It actually representing a hole, a gap in knowledge in the middle.
I think there's a knowledge gap for sure, a process gap as well, but a gap on which I think you can iterate to get closer to what the right process is, and in some cases a technology gap. Right.
So that's where the tooling plugs in, but according to need.
Yes, I don't think there's yet a kind of one size fits all approach to what given the different technical platforms different companies will have.
Yeah.
I don't think there's necessarily a one size fits all approach.
Okay. So what's on the sort of end to end homogeneous versus best of breed heterogeneous? You're towards the sort of the multitude. There's going to be a series of tools that you're going to plug together according to need, and it's best of breed plugging together.
I think so. It's like I'm sure that there will be some that will emerge as the strongest, and that will go then horizontally and support more of the life cycle. But for now, from what I've seen from today, in fact, in particular, I've learned that Luke's map of the tooling across the different parts of the life cycle super useful to me, actually, because now I can see much more clearly than before where the different parts of tooling fit in and solve different problems.
Yeah, because obviously the data has been something that's been bolted on the side, and now it's thinking through in terms of a mature the data governance that Lewis was talking about, having a data strategy, having a data culture within the business, and presumably you've had first-hand experience of trying to build a data culture.
Yeah, that's right.
So could you maybe just say something briefly about that? We've only a couple of minutes, but what's your experience of a data culture? It's
what I touched on when I was saying that I think businesses are looking to move from data informed to data driven, and they start to understand what it means. But to really support that, you need a data culture where you prize data, where you guard it, and so that you're compliant and governance, and caring about the ethics of the outcome for the customer. But you're also making sure that you do recognise its value and store it and use it. So appropriately conscious approach to be quite forward-looking about the data that you prize, treat it as an asset, centralise it, so that one team can benefit from the work of another.
Okay.
And I suppose the other thing I've learned is that if someone asks a question about data and so they want to use it to diagnose a problem, pretty soon they're going to want to activate it and use it in operations to solve the problem. So if you don't want your data warehouse to become a big dependency and blocker for your business, then you need to take that into account in your data platform of choice and make sure that you can really activate all of the data that you have in the business
Okay, so
not
so it's
just
the,
analyze it.
okay, and by activate you mean that's the access to data that you know you have.
Yeah, access to data so that you can stream it if you're
Okay.
going to have a real-time use case.
I see. Yeah.
And so that you can depend on it, and your dev team aren't going to be worried about being phoned
Yeah.
up at 3 a.m.
Okay, great. Well, the conversation is clearly going to run and run. So thank you for being part of it today. Hope you've enjoyed yourself. And